Over the last few videos, we've been looking at front ends written in Angular and then in Blazor that pass a JWT, a JSON Web Token, back to the server so that they can provide authentication to prove that the user is who they say they are. And as promised, I'm going to do this in the third front-end technology now, which is React. So as ever, I've created the basics of an application. This really should look exactly like the ones in Blazor and Angular because I've used the same styling and everything like that. There we can see we've got all of the reviews. There we can see we've just got the summary of the reviews, and then we've got a login, which as yet doesn't work. That's what we're going to be hooking up and making work on this video. And if we just take a quick look at the back end of this, at the moment I've got the authorization commented out on the .NET web service. So let's put that back in. So we'll stop that, remove the comment, start it up again. And we don't need the Swagger. Let's go back to our React. And what that now means is when we go to all reviews or summary, we get a failed to retrieve data because we're not authenticated, and that's what the server's asking for. Let's take a quick look at the code that we've got in there. So what I've got is a component called reviews, and what that does is looks to see whether we've set the style of the review to summary or all, which is the default, and then we'll either do the get summary or we'll do the get all reviews, and that's being called on a review repository, and the review repository is using simply the fetch API. So this is something you'll find is rather different in something like React from Angular. Angular has its own library for doing HTTP requests, whereas in React, to start with at least, we typically just use the basic fetch API that we have within JavaScript, though we are going to change that in a moment. But there we can see we're calling the server. We've got a config that's just got the base URL in there. So if we just look at the config file there, we've just set that up as it stands. And then we have the failed to retrieve that we just saw because we're not logged in. And we're getting back here a promise of array of book reviews. In either case, either all the book reviews or just the summary. That's what we've got. Now I've put quite a lot of the code together already just to save time. So what happens here is at the moment, if we go to the login page and I log in with any old data at all, so that's obviously not the valid username and password, but at the moment it does log us in. It gives us a dummy time. It gives us a dummy user. Still obviously can't actually connect because we haven't properly logged in, but we also have a log out, and therefore we just go back to the original state. And that's just to save a bit of time in doing some coding, because I've put all of that in a thing called an authentication context. Now, in React, we don't have, by default, dependency injection and injectable services, but the sort of thing we can do is have an authentication context. And the way that has to work in React, we don't, again, unlike Angular or Blazor, have a constant monitoring of all our data-bound properties so that when they change, the DOM and the display get refreshed. We have to have this thing called a state hook, which specifically means we set the state when it changes, and that's what triggers the refresh. And so that's why we have this authentication context. And what I've got in this context is 2 bits of data. We've got the username and simply a boolean to say is logged in, and then we've got 2 methods, a login and a logout, that we're both just defining there in that interface. And then at the moment the code's set up like this. So here we've got this idea of use state, so we can set and get the logged in state, the boolean, which is defaulting to false, and set and get the username, which is defaulting to blank. Then we've got our login method, and all that does, it just logs that so we can see what's going on just if we want to look in the console, sets the logged in to true, sets the username to dummy user, and sets the return date to just a fixed date. And then the logout simply changes the logged in state to false and the username to blank. And then that's hooked up in both the login component. So here we get hold of that login method from this authentication context. So we have a use context, get hold of the login, and that's where we pass in the username and the password, simple enough. And then also we make use of that in the user component. Again, we get hold of the authentication context. In this case, we want the username, the is logged in, and the logout. We check to see if we're logged in and display either the login if we're not logged in or the welcome message using the username, and the click calls the logout. So you can see there within the context we've got these 4 bits of information so far, and One of them, simply the login method, is being used in the login control, so we get hold of that. And then the other three are being used in the user control. Okay, so that's how we've got things started. Now let's move that on to having this to actually do the authentication properly. And the first thing we've got to do there is change the fact that we're using, as I mentioned, the standard fetch API. Because although it's just there available for us, we need to change that to something that will allow the equivalent of the interceptors that we've seen in Angular or the handlers that we saw in Blazor. So we're going to change that, and we're going to use a very common package, but it's not an integral part of React. React isn't like that. It's very basic in its minimal installation, but we're going to use one called Axios. So all we need to do is just go in here and do an npm I of Axios, and then wait a little while for that to install. So that's in there now. And then we'll change this code in the repository. So we're going to say Axios dot, we'll get hold of the import for that. And then we simply do a get. But the nice thing, or at least the first nice thing about Axios, is we can now use generics to specify the type of data we're getting back. And so that's going to be our array of book review. So nice and type safe in there. That response still has a status, so we're checking that it's okay. But then in terms of the actual data, we don't need to do the further await and call that JSON method like we did with fetch. We can simply change that to data, and that should now be getting us our book reviews through Axios. No real change at the moment, but once we've got Axios, that allows us to add the interceptor. But we're not going to do that immediately. The immediate thing we've got to do is actually do the login to get hold of the JWT. And so if we go back to our authentication context, we'd already got the login method on here, but obviously now we need to make it work properly. And the first thing we've got to do here is send our post request off to the server to get hold of the JWT. So let's do that. So in here, what we're going to do is we're going to say const response equals await. And then again, we're going to use Axios. So get hold of the import for that. And in this time, it's going to be a post. The response is going to be our login response, which is the same structure we've been using everywhere else. So that's just declares an interface. It's got the token and it's got the expiration date. So we'll have that there. And then that's going to be passing in the config for the beginning of the path to the server. So that, remember, is our config dot. And let's just copy the input of that one from here. And then we can do the dot server URL slash API slash authentication slash login. And then additionally, on the end of that, we've got to pass in the model, which again is predefined. So that was the model that contains the username and password. So simple enough there. So that will do our post request. And once again, we need to check for an error. So we'll just say if response.status is not okay, then we'll just throw an exception that just says login failed. But if it is okay, we need to start extracting the data from that. So first thing we're going to do, like we've done before, is we're going to take that JWT out of the response and put it into session storage. So we've got a key that I just commented out there. We'll put that back in, same thing we've had before. So we're going to do a set item with the JWT key, and then its response.data dot, and then because it's strongly typed, we can just put the JWT token in there. We also, though, want to cache that token. So we're actually going to do that again with some state. So what I'm going to do up here is add a new state variable. So we're going to say const and then JWT for reading it, set JWT for writing it equals use state. And then the initial value is going to be what we try to fetch from the session storage, so that if it is already in session, when we come in here, it'll work fine. That would be important if we'd logged in and then just done a refresh. Remember, session will disappear if we shut down the browser and open up again, but not on a refresh. So we'll put that in there. So we'll initialize that to session storage dot get item JWT key. And then a little quirk actually, session storage, you'll notice the type we've got there at the moment, it's giving us back string or null. Whereas the way we actually need it to be defined is string or undefined. So simple enough, we can just put double question mark undefined. So that means that if it's null, it'll actually switch to undefined. Just makes life a bit easier in terms of the typing, rather than having to have all three possibilities. So that's what we've got there. And then when we do the login, as well as putting it into session, we'll cache it effectively by doing set JWT and just passing the same thing in there. Then we also need to change the logged in status. Well, that's easy enough because we can do that with that code there. And then the username, dummy user, well, again, we can get that off the token, but remember, we've got to do a bit of work on that to extract it from the token. So actually, I've written this already. Nothing new there whatsoever, which is why I've written before. So that's exactly what we were doing in the Angular. In fact, I took this code straight from the Angular. And so remember, on our JSON Web Token, we have the three sections. The middle section has the payload data, and so we can get hold of the name claim out of that, and that'll be our username. So all we need to do here is on this one, we're going to say JWT to username, and then pass in the token again, and that will work like that. And then for return, we're going to return not that arbitrary date, but response.data.expiration. Remember, that comes as a string, but we're now converting that to a date. One other thing I'll do here, actually, if we just go back to the declaration of these states, we no longer want the default to be false and blank, because if we have already got the JWT key in session storage, we want to be able to actually make use of that. So what we do here is, instead of false, we set that to not JWT. So that just converts the object, which could be a string or undefined, to a Boolean. So if it's a string, it's true, we're logged in. If it's undefined, it's false. And then similarly on this one here, we're going to do the JWT to username, again on the JWT, which we hope has been fetched from the storage. If it's not been fetched, that'll be undefined. And again, that works fine on there because they'll just return blank. So at that point, we should be able to log in. We're still not going to be able to see the data because we haven't put the JWT into the header when we make the requests, but for the actual getting hold of the JWT, we can do that. So if we save all of that and then go in here and go to login, let's firstly test it with a bad login. So just put some garbage in there, click on login, and we're getting the request failed because it wasn't validated. But if I change that to the login we now know and love, so Jasper Kent and PA $W0RD, click on that, and now we're getting back 3 hours from now, and we can see it's got hold of the username, set the logout button on there, and then also when we log out, we can see that it's logged out, and so we're no longer logged in. One actual extra thing we need to do on the logout, you can see on the logout we're setting is logged in to false, we're setting the username to blank, but obviously we also need to set the JWT to undefined, and not only the cache version, but we also need to remove it from the session. So we're going to say session storage dot remove item, and then again our JWT key. So that will tidy everything up when we log out. So we've got the login. We can just prove that. If I log in again, then we can see that we've got the token. So if I just go in there and have a look at application and look in there, there we can see the token as we'd expected. So now we need to make sure that goes into the headers when we're making the requests. And this is done with an interceptor, but done in Axios, which is why I included that in the first place. So what we're going to do is, in this authentication provider, I'm going to use another React feature, which is I'm going to use an effects hook. And so what I'm going to say is use effect, and then I'll just put in an empty effect for now, get all the import. But what I'm going to do with this is make this dependent on the isLoggedIn and the JWT. Because the point is, what we'll get here is a bit of code that will fire every time either JWT or isLoggedIn is changed. They should actually change absolutely in sync, so technically we don't really need them both, but it's just a bit safer to have them both in there. So this is going to be the code we have. And the way we're going to make this work is I'm actually going to have the interceptor added when we are logged in and then removed when we're not logged in. So a bit different from how we did it before, where we always had it there and then checked inside it what we were going to do. Here we're going to turn it on and turn it off as we go along. So what I'm going to do here is do that test. So I'm going to say if we're logged in, then we're going to put in this interceptor. And so the way we declare that is we say axios.interceptors. This is going to be a request interceptor, so we put it on the request, and then we say .use, and then now we write the interceptor, so in comes the request, and so there is the body of the request that we're writing. And so what we're going to do with that, previously we needed to check whether we were logged in, but of course we don't now, because this interceptor is only going to exist if we're logged in. So instead we just need to do the other check, which is to make sure that this particular request actually is going to the server, not to some other server, because we only want to send the JWT back to the place that we're trying to use it for authentication. So we say is to server, and then we say equals request dot URL. That could be null, so we've got to put a question there, dot starts with, and then the same sort of code we've seen before. And remember, we can get hold of that by using the config server URL, and so that will just make sure that it's going to the right place. And then we can say if is to server. We already, as I say, know that it's logged in. And then in that case, very simple, we can just say request.headers. It's the authorization header. And we need it to be equal to bearer, as we've seen before. And then we put in the JWT, which we already have because that's one of our state variables that we declared just up here. So that's what we need to do. And then the last thing we need to do here, we've simply got to return the request. And that's because, just like with all the other examples we've seen, there may be multiple interceptors, and so they can each do their bit. So if we're logged in, we're going to add the request. Remember, we only come in here if the state of logged in or JWT is changed. And so after that, we're going to put the else. And then on here, we can simply clear away the interceptors. So we can say axios.interceptors.request.clear. So that'll remove any intercepts that we have. And that really should be it all working. So if I do a save on that, and then let's go back here and let's log out. And if we go to the all reviews and the summary, we can see they're getting nothing there at all. So not authorized, but then if we put the username and the password, looks like we're logged in, go to all reviews, and we can see we've got that data on there, all working fine. Log out again, and we've lost that data. So there we've got exactly the same behavior as we had with our Angular example and our Blazor example. Still not perfect in terms of the user experience. Things like the fact that when we log out, we maybe should be redirected to the login page or whatever it might be. But the principles are there. And if you want to enhance that for yourselves, I'm sure you can. That's really it for our basic look at those different front-end technologies, all of them referring back to that ASP.NET web service, which is doing the actual authentication. But something that lots of people have been asking about, and I have been planning to do it, but you've got to build up these things in steps, is to look at the idea of refresh tokens. So a way that we can securely make it so that when that time period, so 3 hours we've had on our JWT, when that expires, that we can log in again in an easy but secure way so that you don't have to re-enter your credentials every 3 hours. So that's what we're going to be looking at next time. So if you enjoyed that, do click like, and to see that next video, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.